Welcome to the Nightfall Historian. Please like, subscribe, and listen peacefully. A brief history of the United States. The land that would eventually become the United States was inhabited by Native American peoples for tens of thousands of years. Their descendants today include hundreds of distinct nations and tribes, many of which are federally recognized. These indigenous societies developed diverse cultures, economies, and systems of governance long before European contact. In the late 15th century, European exploration of the Americas began. Over time, colonization by European powers, particularly England, led to widespread displacement of indigenous populations, largely due to warfare, forced removal, and exposure to new diseases. In 1607, English settlers founded Jamestown in present-day Virginia, followed by the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620. By the mid-18th century, 13 British colonies had been firmly established along the Atlantic coast. Tensions grew between the colonies in Great Britain after the British government imposed new taxes and laws following its victory in the French and Indian War. Measures such as the Intolerable Acts reduced colonial self-governance and intensified resistance. Arms conflict erupted in April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord, marking the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Later that year, the Continental Congress formed the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. On July 4, 1776, the colonies formally declared independence from British rule through the Declaration of Independence. After years of fighting, the war ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, in which Britain recognized the independence of the United States. A new system of government was established with the signing of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, which was later ratified by the states. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was added to protect individual liberties. George Washington became the nation's first president in 1789. In the early years of the Republic, debates emerged over the balance of power between the federal government and the states. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase significantly expanded the nation's territory. Throughout the 19th century, westward expansion accelerated, driven by economic opportunity and the belief in manifest destiny. This expansion came at a devastating cost to indigenous nations, who were forcibly removed from their lands. The expansion of slavery into new territories became a major national conflict. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1660, several Southern states seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began in 1861 and became the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. The Union's victory in 1865 preserved the nation and led to the abolition of slavery. Shortly after the war ended, President Lincoln was assassinated. During the Reconstruction era, the federal government sought to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. However, by the late 19th century, many of these gains were reversed in the South through segregation laws and voter suppression. Meanwhile, the United States experienced rapid industrial growth during the Gilded Age, fueled by technological innovation, urbanization, and large-scale immigration. In the early 20th century, reform movements addressed corruption, labor conditions, and social inequality. The United States entered World War I in 1917 and emerged as a global power. The economic prosperity of the 1920s ended with the stock market crash of 1929, triggering the Great Depression. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced New Deal programs to stabilize the economy and provide social support. The United States entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The war ended in 1945 with the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, following the use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After the war, the U.S. played a major role in rebuilding Europe and Japan. In the decades that followed, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers in the Cold War. Although they avoided direct conflict, they competed through proxy wars, nuclear arms development, and space exploration. During this period, the civil rights movement led to major legal and social reforms, expanding rights for African Americans. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, leaving the United States as the world's leading superpower. In the years since, the country has faced new challenges, including terrorism, economic crises, and global conflicts. Events such as the September 11th attacks, wars in the Middle East, the Great Recession, and the COVID-19 pandemic have shaped the modern era. Today, the United States continues to play a significant role in global affairs while navigating complex social, political, and economic challenges at home. Indigenous peoples of North America. The earliest human presence in the Americas remains uncertain, but most scholars believe that the first inhabitants arrived from Eurasia during the last ice age. These early people likely crossed a land bridge known as Beringia, which once connected present-day Siberia and Alaska, following herds of animals into a new continent. This migration may have begun as early as 30,000 years ago, with populations gradually moving southward and spreading across the Americas. These early settlers, often referred to as Paleo-Indians, became widely distributed across North America by around 10,000 BCE. During this period, they relied heavily on hunting large Ice Age animals such as mammoths. As many of these species disappeared, Paleo-Indian communities adapted by hunting bison and gathering wild plants, including seeds and berries. Agriculture first emerged in parts of central Mexico around 8000 BCE, marking a major transformation in human society. Over time, farming knowledge spread northward. By about 3000 BCE, corn was being cultivated in what is now Arizona and New Mexico. Early irrigation techniques soon followed, leading to the development of settled communities. By around 300 BCE, cultures such as the Hohokam had established permanent villages in the southwest. One of the earliest identifiable cultures in North America was the Clovis culture, which existed between approximately 9100 and 8850 BCE. Archaeologists recognize this culture by its distinctive fluted stone spear points, known as Clovis points. The Folsom culture followed and shared similar hunting practices, though it is distinguished by a different style of projectile point adapted for hunting bison. Another significant wave of migration occurred around 8000 BCE, bringing Na-Dane-speaking peoples into North America. These groups reached the Pacific Northwest by around 5000 BCE and later expanded along the coast and into the interior. In the Southwest, the Oshara tradition emerged, lasting from roughly 5500 BCE to 600 CE, representing a long period of cultural continuity in the region. In eastern North America, mound-building societies began to appear. Around 600 BCE, the Adena culture started constructing large ceremonial earthenworks. Over time, they became part of the Hopewell tradition, a network of societies linked by long-distance trade. The Hopewell exchange system connected communities across vast areas, from the southeastern woodlands to the Great Lakes. By around 500 CE, Hopewell societies were gradually absorbed into the larger Mississippian cultural tradition. The Mississippian peoples developed complex societies supported by agriculture, trade, and political hierarchy. Their most prominent city was Cahokia, located near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. At its height during the 12th century, Cahokia may have housed around 20,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. The city was centered on Monk's Mound, a massive earthen structure rising approximately 100 feet high. Mississippian societies practiced farming, hunting, and trade, and their religious and social systems were influenced by cultures farther south in Mesoamerica. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblo peoples, sometimes called the Anasazi, began building stone and adobe settlements as early as 900 BCE. Many of these structures were constructed along cliffs for protection and climate control, such as those found at Mesa Verde. Some settlements grew remarkably large. Pueblo Bonito, located in present-day New Mexico, once contained hundreds of interconnected rooms and functioned as a regional center. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, indigenous societies developed some of the most prosperous communities in North America. Abundant natural resources, particularly salmon, supported permanent villages as early as 1000 BCE. These societies shared cultural traditions that emphasized wealth distribution, social status, and ceremony, most notably through the potlatch, a gift-giving feast that reinforced community bonds and leadership. In the northeastern woodlands, the Iroquois Confederacy emerged in the 15th century. This alliance united the Mohawk, Onondaga, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations under a shared system of governance. Each nation was represented by appointed leaders who participated in collective decision-making. The Confederacy became a powerful political and military force in the region, engaging in both diplomacy and conflict with neighboring tribes and later European settlers. Some historians suggest that elements of Iroquois governance influenced political ideas during the formation of the United States. As Iroquois influence expanded, some neighboring groups were pushed westward, including peoples such as the Osage, Ka, Ponca, and Omaha. Despite displacement and conflict, indigenous nations across North America maintained rich cultural traditions, complex social structures, and deep connections to their lands, foundations that shaped the continent long before European colonization. Early settlement and European colonization of American lands. Native Hawaiians. The precise timing of human settlement in the Hawaiian Islands remains debated, but most scholars agree that the first Polynesian settlers arrived between approximately 940 and 1130 CE. These early voyagers crossed vast distances of the Pacific Ocean using advanced navigation techniques. Around the year 1200, settlers from Tahiti arrived, strengthening cultural and political ties across Polynesia and contributing to the rise of a distinct Hawaiian civilization. For centuries, Hawaiian society developed in isolation, shaped by agriculture, religion, and a strict social hierarchy. This isolation ended in 1778 when British explorer James Cook reached the islands. Within a few years of European contact, access to firearms and military tactics allowed Kamehameha I to wage a successful campaign across the archipelago. By the early 19th century, he had unified most of the islands under single rule, establishing the Kingdom of Hawaii. Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been continuously inhabited for at least 4,000 years. The island's earliest known settlers belonged to the Ortoroid culture, followed by several waves of migration that either displaced or absorbed earlier populations. By around the year 1000 CE, Arawak-speaking peoples from South America arrived via the Lesser Antilles. These settlers developed into the Taíno society encountered by Spanish explorers in 1493. At the time of European arrival, Puerto Rico's indigenous population is estimated to have numbered between 30,000 and 60,000 people, governed by local chiefs known as caciques. Spanish colonization led to dramatic population decline due to forced labor under the encomienda system and the spread of European diseases. Puerto Rico remained under Spanish rule for centuries before being transferred to the United States in 1898 following the Spanish-American War. Early European exploration and Norse contact. The earliest known European reference to the Americas appears in the writings of the medieval scholar Adam of Bremen around 1075, where a land called Vinland is mentioned. Norse sagas also describe voyages across the Atlantic, and archaeological evidence confirms the existence of Norse settlements in present-day Canada. While there is debate over whether Norse explorers reached further south, their presence represents the earliest documented European contact with North America. The Columbian Exchange and early settlements. European exploration permanently altered both the Americas and Europe. Animals such as horses, cattle, and pigs were introduced to the New World, while crops including maize, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, and squash were brought to Europe. These exchanges reshaped diets, economies, and environments on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the most devastating consequence for indigenous peoples was the spread of Eurasian diseases such as smallpox and measles. Lacking immunity, Native American populations suffered catastrophic losses, often before sustained European settlement had begun. Entire communities were disrupted or destroyed by these epidemics. Spanish exploration and settlement. Following Christopher Columbus's voyages beginning in 1492, Spain established colonies throughout the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico and nearby islands. Spanish explorers soon ventured northward. Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida in 1513, marking Spain's first documented presence in what is now the continental United States. During the mid-16th century, Spanish expeditions pushed deep into the interior. Hernando de Soto led explorations throughout the southeastern region, while Francisco Coronado led an expedition from the southwest into the Great Plains in search of gold. Horses introduced by the Spanish spread rapidly across the plains, transforming the cultures of indigenous peoples who adopted horseback life within a few generations. Over time, Spanish settlements grew into lasting cities, including San Antonio, Albuquerque, Tucson, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and others, establishing Spain as a dominant colonial power. Early European exploration and Norse contact. The earliest known European reference to the Americas appears in the writings of the medieval scholar Adam of Bremen around 1075, where a land called Vinland is mentioned. Norse sagas also describe voyages across the Atlantic, and archaeological evidence confirms the existence of Norse settlements in present-day Canada. While there is debate over whether Norse explorers reached further south, their presence represents the earliest documented European contact with North America. The Columbian Exchange and early settlements. European exploration permanently altered both the Americas and Europe. Animals such as horses, cattle, and pigs were introduced to the New World, while crops including maize, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, and squash were brought to Europe. These exchanges reshaped diets, economies, and environments on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the most devastating consequence for indigenous peoples was the spread of Eurasian diseases such as smallpox and measles. Lacking immunity, Native American populations suffered catastrophic losses, often before sustained European settlement had begun. Entire communities were disrupted or destroyed by these epidemics. Spanish exploration and settlement. Following Christopher Columbus's voyages beginning in 1492, Spain established colonies throughout the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico and nearby islands. Spanish explorers soon ventured northward. Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida in 1513, marking Spain's first documented presence in what is now the continental United States. During the mid-16th century, Spanish expeditions pushed deep into the interior. Hernando de Soto led explorations throughout the southeastern region, while Francisco Coronado led an expedition from the southwest into the Great Plains in search of gold. Horses introduced by the Spanish spread rapidly across the plains, transforming the cultures of indigenous peoples who adopted horseback life within a few generations. Over time, Spanish settlements grew into lasting cities, including San Antonio, Albuquerque, Tucson, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and others, establishing Spain as a dominant colonial power. Early European exploration and Norse contact. The earliest known European reference to the Americas appears in the writings of the medieval scholar Adam of Bremen around 1075, where a land called Vinland is mentioned. Norse sagas also describe voyages across the Atlantic, and archaeological evidence confirms the existence of Norse settlements in present-day Canada. While there is debate over whether Norse explorers reached further south, their presence represents the earliest documented European contact with North America. The Columbian Exchange and early settlements. European exploration permanently altered both the Americas and Europe. Animals such as horses, cattle, and pigs were introduced to the New World, while crops including maize, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, and squash were brought to Europe. These exchanges reshaped diets, economies, and environments on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the most devastating consequence for indigenous peoples was the spread of Eurasian diseases such as smallpox and measles. Lacking immunity, Native American populations suffered catastrophic losses, often before sustained European settlement had begun. Entire communities were disrupted or destroyed by these epidemics. Spanish exploration and settlement. Following Christopher Columbus's voyages beginning in 1492, Spain established colonies throughout the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico and nearby islands. Spanish explorers soon ventured northward. Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida in 1513, marking Spain's first documented presence in what is now the continental United States. During the mid-16th century, Spanish expeditions pushed deep into the interior. Hernando de Soto led explorations throughout the southeastern region, while Francisco Coronado led an expedition from the southwest into the Great Plains in search of gold. Horses introduced by the Spanish spread rapidly across the plains, transforming the cultures of indigenous peoples who adopted horseback life within a few generations. Over time, Spanish settlements grew into lasting cities, including San Antonio, Albuquerque. The growth of the English colonies in America. Jamestown and the first permanent settlement. The first successful English colony in North America was established in 1607 along the James River in present-day Virginia. Founded by the Virginia Company, Jamestown struggled from the beginning. Many settlers arrived expecting quick wealth from gold and were unprepared for the harsh realities of life in an unfamiliar land. Disease, hunger, and poor leadership nearly destroyed the colony in its early years. Captain John Smith played a crucial role in keeping Jamestown alive during its first year by enforcing discipline and organizing trade with nearby Native American groups. After Smith returned to England, the colony again faced severe hardship. Its fortunes changed in 1612 when John Rolfe began cultivating tobacco using seeds imported from the Caribbean. Tobacco soon became highly profitable, and by the 1620s it had transformed Virginia's economy. In 1624, after years of instability and violent conflict with indigenous peoples, including a major Powhatan attack in 1622, the English crown dissolved the Virginia Company and placed the colony under royal control. The New England colonies. New England was largely settled by English Protestants seeking religious freedom. In 1620, a group known as the Pilgrims sailed aboard the Mayflower, intending to reach Virginia, but instead landed at Plymouth. Before going ashore, they agreed to govern themselves through the Mayflower Compact, a foundational agreement emphasizing self-rule. The first winter was devastating, claiming nearly half of the settlers' lives. Survival became possible only after assistance from the Wampanoag people, who taught the newcomers how to grow corn and adapt to local conditions. A larger wave of settlement followed in 1630 with the arrival of Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were granted a charter that allowed a significant degree of self-government and elected John Winthrop as governor. However, religious conformity was strictly enforced. Roger Williams, who opposed both religious intolerance and the seizure of Native American land, was banished and later founded Rhode Island as a colony based on religious freedom. Additional settlements developed throughout the Connecticut River Valley and along the coasts of New Hampshire and Maine. Relations with Native Americans deteriorated over time, leading to violent conflicts, such as the Pequot War in 1637 and King Philip's War in 1675, one of the deadliest wars in colonial history. Due to poor soil and rugged terrain, New England did not rely heavily on agriculture. Instead, it became a center for shipbuilding, fishing, trade, and small-scale manufacturing. Rivers powered mills and sawmills, while deep harbors supported overseas commerce. Boston emerged as one of the most important ports in colonial America. The Middle Colonies. During the 1660s, the Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, were established from territories formerly controlled by the Dutch. These colonies were notable for their ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity. Dutch, English, Germans, Scandinavians, and others lived side by side, practicing a wide range of religions. At the same time, the Iroquois Confederacy in present-day New York grew into a powerful political and military alliance, strengthened through trade relationships with European powers. Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn, became the last of the Middle Colonies. He envisioned it as a refuge for religious minorities, especially Quakers. Its capital, Philadelphia, quickly developed into a major commercial center. German immigrants settled inland, while Scottish-Irish migrants pushed toward the western frontier. The Southern Colonies. The Southern colonies developed quite differently from those in the North. Maryland was founded in 1632 as a haven for English Catholics, while Virginia continued to expand its plantation economy. Large landowners established vast estates along coastal waterways, relying increasingly on enslaved labor. In 1670, the province of Carolina was founded, with Charleston becoming a major trading hub. Its economy was more diverse than Virginia's, exporting rice, indigo, and timber. Carolina was eventually divided into North Carolina and South Carolina in 1712. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, was established in 1732 as a buffer against Spanish Florida and as a social reform experiment for debtors and the poor. Religion and the Great Awakening. Religion played a central role in colonial life, especially during the First Great Awakening of the 1740s. Traveling preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield inspired emotional religious revivals across the colonies. These movements emphasized personal faith, spiritual rebirth, and a direct relationship with God. Evangelical Christianity spread rapidly and laid the groundwork for later religious movements, including the Second Great Awakening. Colonial government and society. Each colony developed its own political structure, but most were governed by a royal or proprietary governor appointed from England, along with a locally elected assembly that handled taxation and lawmaking. By the 18th century, the colonies were growing rapidly due to abundant land, high birth rates, and continued immigration. Many immigrants arrived as indentured servants, agreeing to work for several years in exchange for passage to America. Others came seeking economic opportunity or religious freedom. Over time, labor shortages contributed to the expansion of slavery. Africans were first brought to Virginia in 1619, and although some initially gained freedom, slavery gradually became permanent and hereditary. By the 1770s, enslaved Africans made up roughly a fifth of the colonial population. Rising tensions with Britain. For much of the colonial period, independence was not a major concern. The colonies relied on British military protection, particularly against France and Spain. After Britain's victory in the French and Indian War, these threats diminished. However, Britain sought to tighten control over its colonies, enforcing mercantilist policies designed to benefit the mother country. Parliament passed new taxes, including the Stamp Act of 1665, without colonial consent. Colonists protested under the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Tensions escalated with incidents such as the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. In response, Britain imposed the Intolerable Acts, stripping Massachusetts of its self-government. Colonial leaders from across the 13 colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress to coordinate resistance, organize boycotts, and demand recognition of colonial rights. When these efforts failed, the colonies moved steadily toward open rebellion. The American Revolution and the birth of a nation. Declaring independence. By the summer of 1776, tensions between Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. On July 2nd, the Second Continental Congress voted in favor of independence, and 2 days later formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document outlined the colonies' grievances against British rule and asserted Enlightenment ideals, declaring that all people are born equal and possess natural rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It rejected monarchy and embraced republican self-government based on the consent of the governed. July 4, 1776, soon became celebrated as Independence Day. The Revolutionary War. The American Revolutionary War had already begun more than a year earlier, with armed conflict erupting at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army, tasked with uniting colonial forces against the British Empire. Early victories were uneven, but Washington's daring crossing of the Delaware River marked a turning point, leading to a series of successes in New Jersey. In 1777, Britain attempted to divide the colonies by seizing Albany, New York. Instead, American forces won a decisive victory at Saratoga, convincing France, along with Spain and the Netherlands, to support the American cause with troops, money, and naval power. Britain shifted its strategy to the southern colonies, capturing Savannah in 1778. However, American and Allied forces gradually regained control. The war effectively ended in October 1781 when British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. King George III ordered an end to hostilities in late 1782, and Britain formally recognized American independence with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The Confederation Era. Following independence, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, a system designed to limit centralized authority and preserve state power. This weak national government struggled to raise taxes, regulate commerce, or repay war debts. Economic instability followed, and events such as Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts exposed the fragility of the Union. As settlers moved westward, states ceded their western lands to the federal government, forming new territories. Conflict continued along the frontier as Native American nations resisted displacement, sometimes through armed conflict, but ultimately were overwhelmed by U.S. military force and settler expansion. The national government, however, lacked the resources to provide effective defense or stability. The Constitutional Convention. Concerned about the nation's survival, reform-minded leaders, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War, pushed for change. In 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia and drafted a new constitution. The document established a federal system with a stronger executive branch, an independent judiciary, and the power to tax, while still limiting authority through separation of powers and checks and balances. Ratification was achieved in 1788, allowing the new government to take effect. The Early Republic. Washington and the new government. George Washington was unanimously elected the nation's first president in 1789. The capital moved from New York to Philadelphia and later to the newly established city of Washington, D.C. Under Washington's leadership, the federal government gained legitimacy and stability. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton introduced policies to strengthen the national economy, including assuming state debts, establishing a national bank, and implementing tariffs. These measures sparked political opposition, leading to the formation of America's first political parties. To ease fears of centralized power, the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, protecting individual freedoms. Party politics and early challenges. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison organized opposition to Hamilton's vision, forming what became the Democratic-Republican Party. Political divisions deepened during debates over foreign policy, particularly with Britain and France. Domestic unrest also challenged the young nation, including conflicts with Native American nations and the Whiskey Rebellion, which tested federal authority. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms established a lasting precedent. His successor, John Adams, faced rising tensions with France, leading to the undeclared Quasi-War. The Federalist Party weakened after controversial measures such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were seen as attacks on civil liberties. Slavery and social change. In the decades following independence, attitudes towards slavery shifted unevenly across the nation. Northern states gradually abolished the institution, while Upper South states made manumission easier, increasing the free black population. However, slavery expanded rapidly in the Deep South as plantation agriculture grew. In 1807, Congress ended American participation in the Atlantic slave trade, though slavery itself continued to expand domestically. The Second Great Awakening. Beginning around 1890, a powerful religious revival swept the country. The Second Great Awakening emphasized personal faith and spiritual renewal, drawing millions into evangelical Protestant churches. It inspired reform movements such as abolitionism and temperance, and reshaped American religious and social life. Jeffersonian America and westward expansion. Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the election of 1000, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties. His presidency was defined by the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the nation's size and opened vast lands for settlement. Jefferson championed an agrarian vision of republicanism, valuing independent farmers over urban industry. During this period, Chief Justice Marshall strengthened the Supreme Court's authority, establishing judicial review in the landmark case Marbury v. Madison, which clarified the court's role in interpreting the Constitution. The War of 1812. Rising tensions with Britain over trade restrictions, naval impressment, and British support for Native American resistance led the United States to declare war in 1812. The conflict was marked by early setbacks, including failed invasions of Canada and damaging British blockades. American fortunes improved with naval victories on the Great Lakes and military successes against Native American forces. In 1814, British troops burned Washington, D.C., but failed to capture Baltimore. The war concluded with the Treaty of Ghent, restoring pre-war boundaries. Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty was signed, boosted national pride and reinforced American identity. The Era of Good Feelings. After the war, the Federalist Party collapsed, leaving a period of political unity under President Monroe. The government re-established a national bank, imposed protective tariffs, and promoted economic development. This period became known as the Era of Good Feelings. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine declared that European powers should not interfere in the Western Hemisphere, marking a significant moment in U.S. foreign policy. Jacksonian America. Andrew Jackson rose to power as a champion of the common man. Distrustful of centralized banking, he dismantled the Second Bank of the United States and redirected federal funds into state-controlled institutions. His presidency reshaped American politics and marked the transition into a more populist era. Expansion, Reform, and Rising Tensions, 1830 to 1848. The Second Party System. Following the presidency of James Monroe, the once dominant Democratic-Republican Party fractured over leadership and ideology. From this split emerged the Democratic Party, led by Andrew Jackson and Van Buren. Jackson's supporters believed they represented the true will of the people, arguing that political power had finally shifted away from elites and into the hands of ordinary citizens. The Democrats built the first highly organized national political party in U.S. history, relying on disciplined party structures, loyal newspapers, and strong state organizations. Their success reshaped American politics, making party loyalty and mass participation defining features of the 19th century. Opposing Jacksonian Democrats were the Whigs, led by figures like Henry Clay. The Whigs supported congressional authority, economic modernization, and federal investment in infrastructure. While competitive for several decades, the Whig Party struggled to remain united, particularly over the growing controversy surrounding slavery. Westward expansion and manifest destiny. During the early 19th century, the United States expanded rapidly in both population and territory as settlers pushed westward. This movement was driven by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to occupy the entire continent. Democrats largely embraced this vision, while many Whigs feared unchecked expansion would hinder industrial growth and deepen sectional divisions. Native American nations resisted displacement, sometimes through armed conflict, but ultimately were overwhelmed by U.S. military force and settler expansion. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced relocation of tribes from the eastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River. This policy devastated Native communities, most notably the Cherokee, whose forced march, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in thousands of deaths. Some tribes, including the Seminole in Florida, resisted removal for years, leading to prolonged warfare. Despite resistance, federal policy ultimately succeeded in clearing vast areas for white settlement. Territorial growth and the Mexican-American War. American expansion, migration, gold, and the West. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 triggered a massive migration, drawing hundreds of thousands of people from across the United States and abroad. California's non-native population exploded within a few years, transforming the region economically and politically. Native populations, however, suffered catastrophic losses due to violence, displacement, and government-backed removal policies. At the same time, settlers traveled west along routes such as the Oregon Trail, enduring months-long journeys in search of land and opportunity. Diplomatic negotiations with Britain secured U.S. control of the Oregon Territory, avoiding armed conflict. American expansion even extended beyond the mainland. The demand for guano, a valuable fertilizer, prompted Congress to pass the Guano Islands Act, allowing U.S. citizens to claim uninhabited islands rich in deposits. This marked an early step toward overseas territorial acquisition. Reform movements and women's rights. As the nation expanded, reform movements gained momentum. Inspired by ideals of equality and justice, activists sought to address social issues ranging from slavery to alcohol consumption. In 1848, the women's rights movement formally emerged at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. Led by reformers such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, participants issued a declaration of sentiments demanding equal legal rights for women, including the right to vote. This gathering launched the first organized campaign for women's suffrage in the United States and laid the foundation for future feminist movements. Civil War and Reconstruction, 1848 to 1877. Sectional divisions over slavery. By the mid-19th century, the nation was deeply divided over slavery. While abolitionists in the North demanded its immediate end, many Northerners simply opposed its expansion into new territories. In contrast, Southern leaders defended slavery as essential to their economy and social order. The plantation system thrived due to international demand for cotton, tying Northern industries and banks to the slave economy. Political power was also affected, as enslaved populations increased Southern representation in Congress. Political compromises and collapse. Efforts to resolve sectional tensions included the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state but strengthened laws requiring the return of escaped slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act enraged many Northerners, who resented being forced to assist in maintaining slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 further inflamed tensions by allowing settlers to vote on the legality of slavery, repealing earlier restrictions. Violence erupted in Kansas as pro- and anti-slavery forces clashed. Outrage over these events fueled the rise of the Republican Party, which opposed the spread of slavery. The Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford declared that Black Americans were not citizens and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. The decision shocked the North and intensified fears that slavery would expand unchecked. The American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1680 prompted Southern states to secede, forming the Confederate States of America to protect slavery. The Civil War began in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter. Early battles revealed that the conflict would be long and devastating. While Union forces achieved success in the Western theater, campaigns in the East were marked by costly stalemates. Confederate General Robert E. Lee repeatedly repelled Union advances until turning points emerged. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held areas. That same year, Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg shifted momentum decisively in the North's favor. Union victory and the end of slavery. Under Generals Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union adopted a strategy of total war, crippling the Confederacy's ability to sustain itself. Sherman's march through the South devastated infrastructure and morale. In April 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the war. Slavery was abolished nationwide, and millions of enslaved people were freed. Legacy of the war. The Civil War was the first truly industrial war, relying on railroads, telegraphs, mass-produced weapons, and large-scale mobilization. It remains the deadliest conflict in U.S. history, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed and untold civilian suffering. The war preserved the Union, ended slavery, and transformed the federal government, but it left profound social, economic, and racial challenges that would shape the Reconstruction era and beyond. Reconstruction and National Transformation, 1865 to 1918. Reconstruction after the Civil War. Reconstruction began immediately after the Civil War ended with the Union victory in 1865. Only days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Washington, D.C. Leadership passed to Vice President Andrew Johnson, whose approach to rebuilding the nation would soon clash with Congress. The post-war years brought rapid development to the western United States. Settlement expanded through wagon trains, river transport, and, most significantly, the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. This achievement linked the nation's coasts and accelerated migration, mining, and agriculture. Northeastern European immigrants moved into the prairie states, drawn by inexpensive land, while mining booms in silver and copper fueled Western economic growth. Freedmen and constitutional change. The war left millions of formerly enslaved people facing poverty, displacement, and uncertainty. To address these challenges, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau, the first large-scale national relief agency. Operated by the U.S. Army, the Bureau provided food, education, legal assistance, and aid to freed African Americans and displaced Southerners. Reconstruction brought sweeping constitutional reforms. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting rights for men. Together, these amendments transformed the Constitution and expanded American democracy more than at any previous moment. Political conflict in the South. In the early years of Reconstruction, many former Confederates retained political control in Southern states. This shifted after the 1866 elections, when radical Republicans gained power in Congress. President Johnson opposed many congressional policies and vetoed civil rights legislation, leading to his impeachment in 1868. Although he narrowly avoided removal from office, his influence was severely weakened. Congress temporarily barred many former Confederate leaders from public office and enfranchised black men. New Republican-led state governments emerged, supported by freedmen, northern migrants known as carpetbaggers, and southern white allies called scalawags. These governments expanded public education and civil rights, but faced fierce resistance and accusations of corruption. White supremacy and the end of Reconstruction. Black political participation briefly flourished as Black Americans voted and held public office across the South. In response, white supremacist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan formed to terrorize Black citizens and undermine Republican rule through violence and intimidation. President Ulysses S. Grant used federal authority to suppress the Klan in the early 1970s, but new paramilitary groups soon replaced it. Reconstruction ended following the contested presidential election of 1876. The Compromise of 1877 awarded the presidency to Rutherford Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. With Reconstruction concluded, Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation, suppressed voting through poll taxes and literacy tests, and sanctioned violence against Black Americans. This marked the beginning of one of the darkest periods in American race relations. During this time, immigration laws grew more restrictive. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred most Chinese immigrants, and additional legislation restricted entry for those deemed undesirable, reflecting growing racial and economic anxieties. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, 1877 to 1914. Wealth, industry, and inequality. The late 19th century became known as the Gilded Age, a term highlighting the contrast between immense wealth and deep social inequality. Industrialists and financiers such as J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller accumulated enormous fortunes, while political corruption flourished. Critics warned that democratic ideals were being undermined by the concentration of economic power. Mass immigration fueled industrial expansion. Between 1880 and 1914, millions of Europeans arrived to work in factories, mines, and railroads. Others settled on farmland in the Midwest. Harsh working conditions, economic inequality, and exposure to socialist ideas contributed to the rise of organized labor and political unrest. Labor movements and economic crises. Labor unions formed to improve wages and working conditions. Samuel Gompers led the American Federation of Labor, while farmers organized politically through the Populist Party in response to falling crop prices and rising debt. The Panic of 1893 triggered a severe economic depression, leading to widespread unemployment and labor unrest. One of the most dramatic conflicts was the Pullman Strike of 1894, which was crushed by federal troops. The strike's leader, Eugene V. Debs, later emerged as a prominent socialist figure. Reform and progressivism. Middle-class frustration with corruption and social problems gave rise to the progressive movement in the 1890s. Progressives sought to reform politics, regulate industry, and address urban poverty. Investigative journalists exposed abuses in business and government, helping drive public support for reform. Progressive activism led to major legislative achievements, including antitrust laws and regulations of food, drugs, and railroads. 4 constitutional amendments reshaped American governance: the income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition of alcohol, and women's suffrage. Important reforms included the Civil Service Act, which reduced political patronage, the Interstate Commerce Act, and the Sherman Antitrust Act. The debate over monetary policy divided the nation, culminating in the 1896 election, where Republican William McKinley defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan. Under McKinley, economic prosperity returned, and the United States emerged as the world's leading industrial economy. McKinley's assassination in 1901 elevated Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, ushering in a more assertive era of reform and regulation. The period also transformed American finance. The establishment of credit unions and the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 modernized banking and stabilized the economy. American imperialism and global influence. As the nation industrialized, it expanded its influence overseas. The United States continued military campaigns against Native Americans while confining most tribes to reservations. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point, resulting in American control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and increased influence over Cuba. Debates over imperialism divided Americans. While supporters saw expansion as a sign of national strength, critics argued it contradicted democratic principles. By the early 20th century, U.S. attention shifted toward the Caribbean and the construction of the Panama Canal, completed in 1914. The open door policy asserted equal access to Chinese markets without territorial control. The struggle for women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement regained momentum after the Civil War and achieved early successes in Western states. By the early 20th century, activists intensified their campaign. Leaders such as Alice Paul adopted militant tactics, including public protests and hunger strikes, while others pursued legislative reform. World War I strengthened the argument for women's voting rights as women played vital roles on the home front. In 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote nationwide. The amendment was ratified in 1920, marking a major expansion of democratic participation and reshaping American politics. Modern America and the World Wars, 1914 to 1945. World War I and the interwar period. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially adopted a policy of neutrality under President William Wilson. However, Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare increasingly threatened American shipping and lives. The sinking of civilian vessels, including the RMS Lusitania, heightened tensions. In April 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted attacks on shipping, prompting the United States to declare war. American involvement proved decisive. By mid-1918, General John Pershing's American Expeditionary Forces were arriving in Europe at a rapid pace, while Germany struggled to replace its losses. At home, dissent was suppressed through the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, leading to the imprisonment of thousands who opposed the war. The conflict ended in November 1918 with Allied victory. President Wilson played a leading role at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, promoting his vision for a League of Nations to prevent future wars. However, the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties on Germany, and Wilson's refusal to compromise with Senate Republicans led to the U.S. Senate rejecting both the treaty and American membership in the League. The United States instead turned toward a more isolationist foreign policy. The Russian Revolution fueled fears of communism at home, sparking the first Red Scare. Non-citizens suspected of radical beliefs were arrested or deported. Meanwhile, the nation faced another crisis, the 1918 to 1919 Spanish influenza pandemic, which killed more than 500,000 Americans despite advances in medical care. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, brought rapid economic growth and cultural change. African Americans moved northward during the Great Migration, contributing to cultural movements such as the Harlem Renaissance, which popularized jazz and black literature. At the same time, racial tensions intensified. The Ku Klux Klan resurged, and restrictive immigration laws in 1924 sharply reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Prohibition, enacted through the 18th Amendment in 1920, banned the production and sale of alcohol. Instead of eliminating drinking, it fueled organized crime, with bootlegging gangs dominating major cities. In 1933, prohibition was repealed under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Great Depression and the New Deal. The stock market crash of October 29, 1929, marked the beginning of the Great Depression, the most severe economic crisis in American history. A collapsing financial system, deflation, and mass unemployment followed. By 1933, 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed, farm incomes had collapsed, and industrial production had fallen sharply. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with the New Deal, a sweeping series of reforms designed to stabilize the economy, provide relief to the unemployed, and prevent future depressions. The New Deal introduced lasting programs such as Social Security, unemployment insurance, banking regulation, farm subsidies, and protections for workers' rights. Massive public works projects employed millions through agencies like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. The New Deal reshaped American political ideology, establishing modern liberalism and expanding the federal government's role in economic management. Roosevelt was re-elected 4 times, supported by a broad New Deal coalition. While the economy improved by the mid-1930s, full recovery did not occur until wartime production during World War II eliminated unemployment. Many New Deal programs were later scaled back as conservatives regained influence in Congress. World War II. During the early years of World War II, the United States sought to remain neutral. Congress passed neutrality acts, but President Roosevelt increasingly supported nations resisting fascism. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Roosevelt positioned the U.S. as the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies through the Lend-Lease program while avoiding direct military involvement. This changed abruptly on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack united the nation behind the war effort. Shortly afterward, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, resulting in the forced relocation and incarceration of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. The United States joined the Allied powers alongside Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, and fought a 2-front war. In Europe, American forces helped defeat Nazi Germany, beginning with campaigns in North Africa and Italy and culminating in the D-Day invasion of France in June 1944. Allied forces advanced across Western Europe, while the Soviet Union pushed from the east. Germany surrendered in May 1945. In the Pacific, the U.S. adopted an island-hopping strategy to defeat Japan. Major victories at Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa weakened Japanese defenses. The largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, led to the liberation of the Philippines. Wartime mobilization transformed the U.S. economy. Industrial production surged, unemployment disappeared, and millions of women and African Americans entered the workforce. The federal government tightly controlled wages, prices, and consumer goods. Americans saved much of their income, laying the foundation for post-war prosperity. The war also accelerated scientific research. The Manhattan Project secretly developed atomic weapons, culminating in the first nuclear test in July 1945. In August, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing more than 200,000 people and forcing Japan's surrender. World War II ended in September 1945. Over 400,000 Americans lost their lives in the conflict. The Cold War era, 1945 to 1991. Economic expansion and global leadership. After World War II, the United States emerged as a global superpower, rivaled only by the Soviet Union. The nation abandoned isolationism and helped establish the United Nations, taking a permanent seat on the Security Council. The Central Intelligence Agency was created to manage intelligence operations in the emerging Cold War. American foreign policy focused on containing the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine pledged economic and military assistance to nations resisting communist influence, beginning with Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan followed, providing massive financial aid to rebuild Western Europe, stabilize governments, and revive economies. This assistance strengthened American trade and influence abroad. In 1949, the United States formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, marking its first peacetime military alliance. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact. That same year, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon, intensifying fears of nuclear war. The resulting doctrine of mutually assured destruction discouraged direct conflict but fueled proxy wars around the globe. Cold War conflicts and domestic tensions. The United States fought communist forces in Korea and Vietnam and supported coups against left-wing governments in countries such as Iran and Guatemala. At home, fear of communist infiltration led to McCarthyism, a campaign spearheaded by Senator McCarthy to root out suspected communists in government, labor unions, and the entertainment industry. The House Un-American Activities Committee targeted Hollywood figures, destroying careers. McCarthyism also fueled the Lavender Scare, in which gay Americans were persecuted under the belief that they posed security risks. Thousands lost their jobs as suspicion and fear shaped American political culture. Legacy. By the mid-20th century, the United States had transformed from a regional power to a global leader. World wars reshaped its economy and society, while the Cold War defined its foreign and domestic policies for decades. Though nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945, global tensions continued, marking the beginning of a long ideological struggle that would shape the modern world. The United States from the Eisenhower era to the present. The Eisenhower years, 1953 to 1961. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a celebrated World War II general, won the presidency in 1952 by a wide margin. His administration brought stability after years of war and political tension. Eisenhower brought an end to the Korean War and carefully avoided direct military confrontations with the Soviet Union. Instead of maintaining massive conventional forces, he relied on nuclear deterrence and long-range missile technology to contain communism while reducing military expenditures. Following the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in 1953, Eisenhower cautiously pursued improved relations with Moscow. Domestically, he worked to curb the excesses of McCarthyism, expanded Social Security benefits, and oversaw a period of political cooperation between Republicans and Democrats. The United States experienced extraordinary economic growth during the 1950s. By the middle of the decade, a majority of Americans enjoyed a middle-class standard of living for the first time. Rising wages, affordable housing, and consumer goods fueled suburban expansion and encouraged larger families. This prosperity produced the baby boom, a dramatic increase in birth rates that reshaped American society. Despite economic success, racial inequality remained entrenched. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated public schools were unconstitutional. Resistance followed, especially in the South. When 9 black students attempted to integrate Little Rock Central High School in 1957 and faced violent opposition, Eisenhower deployed federal troops to enforce the law. Grassroots activism soon expanded, with figures such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. leading the Montgomery bus boycott, a landmark protest against segregation. In 1967, the Soviet Union shocked the United States by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This achievement triggered fears that the U.S. was falling behind technologically and militarily. This anxiety sparked the space race, leading Eisenhower to establish NASA in 1958 and significantly expand federal investment in science and education. Social upheaval and reform, 1960s to 1970s. Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, ushering in an era of youthful optimism and heightened Cold War tensions. His administration escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam, failed in the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, and narrowly avoided nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, shocking the nation. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency and used his political skill to push through sweeping reforms. His Great Society agenda aimed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice. Landmark legislation dismantled legal segregation, expanded voting rights, established Medicare and Medicaid, increased funding for education, supported the arts, and strengthened environmental protections. Civil rights, protest, and counterculture. The civil rights movement intensified throughout the 1960s. Nonviolent protests, marches, and boycotts challenged discrimination across the country. Activists endured violence, arrests, and intimidation, but their efforts led to transformative laws, including the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Fair Housing Act. These measures ended the Jim Crow system that had enforced racial segregation for generations. Other marginalized groups also demanded recognition. Native American activists protested broken treaties, with organizations like the American Indian Movement gaining prominence. Latino labor leader Cesar Chavez organized farm workers, securing better wages and working conditions through collective action. The Vietnam War deeply divided the nation. Graphic media coverage and rising casualties fueled massive anti-war demonstrations. At the same time, broader cultural revolutions emerged. Feminism, environmentalism, and youth counterculture challenged traditional norms. More radical movements, such as Black Power, reflected frustration with the slow pace of reform. Tragedy struck again when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. The modern gay rights movement began after the Stonewall detente and economic turmoil, 1970s. Nixon, Ford, and Carter. President Richard Nixon pursued a strategy of easing Cold War tensions through diplomacy. He normalized relations with China, negotiated arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, and began withdrawing U.S. forces from Vietnam. In 1969, the Apollo 11 mission landed Americans on the moon, marking a defining moment of technological achievement. Nixon's presidency collapsed under the weight of the Watergate scandal, leading to his resignation in 1974. Gerald Ford assumed office and formally ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam following the fall of Saigon in 1975. During this period, the global oil crisis triggered inflation, unemployment, and slow economic growth. American industries struggled to compete internationally, while deregulation reshaped the economy. At the same time, Silicon Valley emerged as a hub for personal computing, signaling the dawn of the digital age. Jimmy Carter, elected in 1976, emphasized human rights in foreign policy and helped broker peace between Egypt and Israel. However, his presidency was overshadowed by economic instability and the Iranian hostage crisis, contributing to his defeat in 1980. The end of the Cold War, 1980s, 1991. Reagan and Bush administrations. Ronald Reagan's election marked a conservative political shift. His economic policies reduced taxes, cut regulations, and curtailed social programs. Although the economy initially fell into recession, inflation declined and growth rebounded. However, inequality and homelessness increased. Reagan expanded military spending, revived Cold War rhetoric, and introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative. Despite early tensions, he later developed a productive relationship with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Their negotiations resulted in major arms reduction agreements. George H.W. Bush oversaw the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War. He supported German reunification, invaded Panama to remove its ruler, and led a multinational coalition during the Gulf War to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. Post-Cold War America, 1991, present. Clinton and George W. Bush. The 1990s saw economic expansion driven by the internet and digital innovation. President Bill Clinton balanced the federal budget and oversaw U.S. military involvement in the Balkans. Political polarization intensified, culminating in Clinton's impeachment, though he remained in office. The contested 2000 election brought George W. Bush to power. His presidency was transformed by the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. The U.S. launched the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan and later Iraq. New security laws expanded surveillance powers, while prolonged wars strained public support. The decade ended with the Great Recession, triggered by financial collapse and housing market failure, prompting massive government intervention to stabilize the economy. Obama, Trump, and a divided nation. Obama, elected in 2008, implemented economic stimulus measures, expanded healthcare access, and oversaw the longest economic recovery in U.S. history. His administration legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, ended the Iraq War, and ordered the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. Trump's presidency emphasized nationalism, immigration restrictions, trade disputes, and judicial appointments. His tenure coincided with heightened political polarization, mass protests, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused widespread economic disruption and loss of life. Following Trump's defeat in 2020, claims of election fraud culminated in the January 6th Capitol attack. Biden's presidency focused on economic recovery, infrastructure investment, climate policy, and support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion. The second Trump era and beyond. Donald Trump returned to office in 2025 after winning a non-consecutive second term. His administration enacted sweeping executive actions, restructured federal agencies, and dramatically altered U.S. foreign relations. These developments marked a new phase of political transformation, with long-term consequences still unfolding. Thank you for spending this peaceful moment with the Nightfall Historian. Please like, subscribe, and comment.